This review is for a mature rated game. Viewer discretion is advised. Also keeping notes, I may have got the aspect ratio of the Eternal Darkness footage wrong when recording it. So I'm not sure if that's how it's supposed to look, if it looks real. But then again, what is real? In retrospect, it's easy to call Resident Evil one of the dominant horror franchises in gaming. The first game in the series was even remade for the GameCube, which was likely to surprise anyone thinking that the little cube-shaped system was primarily a kid's console with its Mario games and so on. Resident Evil, however, was a survival horror franchise primarily focused on B-movie plots and jump scares, and its competition, the psychological horror franchise Silent Hill, wasn't likely to appear on a Nintendo system anytime soon. So it seemed like the GameCube needed something different for a horror game. One that was a mature rated game, actually published by Nintendo, one that was developed by Silicon Knights, and was originally going to be on the Nintendo 64, one that was deliberately designed to mess with your head. It was Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, a game that was not commercially successful, much like the GameCube was. Taking place over the course of over 2,000 years and featuring 12 playable characters, the story is gradually unraveled as university student Alexandra Roivas discovers the circumstances behind her grandfather's mysterious, horrifying death, which the police are not able to figure out. She finds, in the secret study of her family's estate, the Tome of Eternal Darkness. It's only through reading it that she learns of the existence of a powerful entity or ancient. Matters are complicated further with the presence of at least 2 other ancients. Alexandra may be the only one that can save humanity, as she experiences the struggles of various chosen ones, or the other playable characters, in their fight against the darkness. The structure of the story is told in chapters consisting of 4 main locations that change over the course of history, and 11 other playable characters alongside Alexandra. She is playable in between chapters where you find the chapter pages of the tome with the clues and knowledge, especially that of magic, you learn. The story is not told chronologically, but in a dramatic, non-linear fashion, with each location mostly having a self-contained story, a piece of a puzzle that makes sense as more pieces are placed together. This all makes for a fair amount of variety, but what is most notable is how creepy and even disturbing the story is, which is more likely due to influences such as H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe, to the point of including a quote from The Raven the moment the game boots up. The dialogue and prose, including the backstories and observations, also tend to be intelligent, mature, and non-patronizing. The story is brought to life with a presentation that is effective despite being dated. The graphics are more so that of an early GameCube title, with problems with pixelation, texturing, and animation. That being said, the characters don't look too bad. The lighting and colours, however, make for a creepy atmosphere, for it can be hard to see sometimes what's going on, which leads to the turning up of the brightness and contrast ruining said creepy atmosphere. The sound is of a higher quality. Voice acting, while occasionally hammy, is generally good, and mostly done by voice actors who would go on to feature in developers Silicon Knights' subsequent project, Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. The music not only complements environments such as a temple or church, but it's also generally very quiet, not to mention unsettling and eerie. One of the best tracks in the game is probably Black Rose. The sound effects are also more than credible, and can deliberately catch you off guard, such as a knock on the door. One other aspect that has to be noted is the camera. The developers didn't go for the static pre-rendered camera angles from the early Resident Evil games that semi-inspired this game, but a camera that follows the character, and more often than not, in a cinematic way. It can probably be compared to Eco as well as Resident Evil Code Veronica. There are times where the camera zooms in or doesn't immediately show nearby dangers. Plus, it can tilt when your character starts to glow green and lose their sanity. And that's only just the beginning, where you're not entirely sure if it's all in your head or not. The gameplay is a little similar to Resident Evil, which consists of exploration, combat, and puzzle solving. The way the 4 main locations are mapped out is not hard to understand, thanks to an in-game map and memorizing them after multiple visits. Depending on the passage of time, as well as what you learn, the locations do open up with new areas to explore. But what can make exploration dangerous are traps, enemies, and puzzles that are in your way. The enemies can be got rid of with a fairly intuitive combat system. Using the control stick and R trigger allows you to lock onto a specific part of the enemy, such as the head, arms, or torso. Then just press the A button to use the equipped weapon. This combat system is taught more so by intuition and feeling, before explaining it with a basic mandatory puzzle. The only problem is that it can be hard sometimes to tell where to stand to land a finishing move on an enemy, but otherwise the combat feels fun and satisfying. Combat is not necessarily repetitive. Depending on the character or time period, weapons and attributes are different. Some characters are more athletic, some use swords, some even have a higher sanity meter, so it all balances out and makes each chapter fresh. Puzzles are also good here. Some of the more interesting ones to solve involve clues, but most of the time it involves a back and forth approach with finding an item to put in the right place. If you don't pay attention to surroundings, again you may have trouble seeing here. You may have walked past an important item spot and could potentially wander around aimlessly. Magic is also the most common way to solve puzzles, plus it is used for combat. It is probably the coolest aspect of Eternal Darkness, and is just as important to the game's lore and story as it is to the gameplay. For starters, most characters can only use magic once they find the Tome of Eternal Darkness at their location, which also includes the spells you've already learned. But how do you learn them? Why, through finding runes, scrolls, circles of power, and the relevant codex, of course. There are spells which recover health and so on, plus give you a shield, damage enemies, or even enchant items or reveal hidden doors. The order in which you find the spells is structured very well, as one spell you learn is more important in one chapter and is barely rendered useless for the rest of the game. Again, some of the spells are important to puzzles, such as using an item effectively or getting rid of a magic barrier. You can also experiment and create spells yourself. More often than not, you'll just create more powerful versions of the spells you learn, but you can still use the runes for spell creation without the game explaining them, just for fun or if you played the game before. The two most important attributes of a spell are its circle of power and alignment rune. The circle of power merely refers to the power of a spell. The more points in a circle, the more time it will take to cast it, and the more magic power it will be drained. But it's still pretty awesome. The alignment rune, however, is where the difficulty and the story come into play. The aforementioned ancients are represented by 3 colours: red, green, and blue. There is a 4th one, but you're better off learning more about that in the game for yourself. And each ancient is either stronger or weaker than the other, in a rock, paper, scissors dynamic. Think of the fire, grass, water strategies of the Pokemon Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle. So, for example, if an enemy is aligned with a green colour, it is weak to a red colour spell, that which can also make your weapon stronger. But does this make the game easy? Not necessarily, no. At the beginning of the game, you play as a Roman centurion named Pius and choose only one of 3 artifacts, each aligned with an ancient. The one you choose affects the kinds of enemies you may face, the order of alignment runes you find in the game, and especially the game's story. There are mostly subtle differences, since the method of progression of the game is basically the same regardless of which alignment is chosen, but it is noticeable. In regards to the story, it does not affect much other than the colours of spells and certain words the characters say. However, each of the ancients' personalities is different, which is fairly interesting. In regards to difficulty, choosing the red alignment, which represents your health meter, can make for the game being harder, but the green alignment, while probably the easiest, affects your sanity meter more, so you may see green bone thief enemies more often, which can not only possess you, but drain your sanity meter rapidly, leading to the possibility of more sanity effects. The so-called sanity effects were heavily publicised, and they don't disappoint. When it comes to messing around with you, when your sanity meter is low, you'll not only lose health, but your character, and maybe you the player, will begin to hallucinate and hear horrible sounds that include moaning and screaming. Without spoiling too much, sanity effects will affect your surroundings and how your character looks, not to mention surprises that appear on screen. Once a sanity effect occurs, the game will flash back to normal, with the character screaming, unsure of what is going on.
This can't be happening!
Some sanity effects are also scripted, or can be seen under certain circumstances, even if your sanity meter is okay. Because the sanity effects were heavily publicised, you can sense the opening seconds of one happening, and not just when the camera tilts as mentioned before. However, they are still unnerving and especially unpredictable, whether scripted or not, all these years later. Some can be extremely subtle, such as blood going down a wall, and make you either check your sanity meter, or in the more extreme scenarios, check your console or TV. The only problem is that some of the effects are dated, considering what televisions were available on the game's release. Considering much the positives of Eternal Darkness, there are some problems with the game, which may depend more so on your gaming prowess or patience. Much of the criticisms mentioned in this review so far are mostly nitpicks, with the possible exception of the back and forth exploration. This can get tedious, and more so if you haven't examined your surroundings carefully. In fact, this is where the game goes downhill somewhat in the later sections of the game. Later chapters do tend to get more lengthy, complete with a big switch puzzle that you do twice. Some enemies are annoying, but that should come down more so to how you figure out how to beat them, such as defeating little trapper enemies with ranged weapons, lest you keep wanting them to send your character to another dimension for a short time. It also would have been nice to have more boss battles in the game. One of them can be somewhat hard, which also leads to the frustration of having to reload your game. You can thankfully save any time there aren't any enemies or traps, but your character dying means you have to sit through the company logos, load the game, see the words "The Darkness Comes," and maybe watch a cutscene you can't skip. This can be considered a small problem, but a retry option or skippable cutscenes after you see them once would have been nice. Speaking of cutscenes, here is one interesting aspect about the story. In short, it can take close to 12 hours to finish, but here's the catch. You have 2 other alignments for the aforementioned Roman centurion didn't choose, which you can remedy by carrying over the save data of a completed game to a new game. To get the secret ending, you have to play the game 3 times. Again, the method of progression is essentially the same, but with aspects of the cutscenes and difficulty changed. It is actually cool to see the differences, especially between that of the actions, yet playing through the game once is mostly satisfactory. That's basically what Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem amounts to. It is a pretty good horror game, with some problems that probably could have been ironed out. But what it does well, it does extremely well. The fact that it's more of a psychological horror game already works in its favour. Much of the presentation and sanity effects, while dated, can really immerse the player. The gameplay, especially the combat and magic system, is solid. The story is also very good, and worth uncovering through doing free runs of the game, and even watching cutscenes on the main menu. Just don't go insane. Though, you may go insane knowing that a sequel to this game with a working title, Shadow of the Eternals, is either on hold or cancelled. Considering the problems with trademarks, Kickstarter funding, and what's happened to Silicon Knights in recent years. A sequel may still come, even in the form of a film or TV show, but considering the story of this game and how the player can get driven insane, it is probably better to appreciate what we've got with this underselling GameCube horror game. Go find a copy of it if you can.